Welcome back to Patman Garage. Today we're going to talk about the cliff notes of my Coyote swap. So what I'm going to do here is kind of go over basic stuff that I did throughout the different months and years, and then I'm going to keep a running total up in this corner over here, and I'm going to have two numbers. I'm going to have a kind of a generic number, because a lot of people are kind of ask me how much time I spent on the truck and think they want to do something similar. And so I'm gonna have a generic number, and then below that I'll have my number, which is going to be different for several reasons. One of them is I did a lot of trial and error. I also did a lot of stuff like rebuilding the front end structurally. Stuff that didn't have to be done as far as just to do a Coyote swap, but wanted to kind of show the difference between those two numbers. So we'll go through and I'll keep the running total up there in that corner. So starting in November of 2017, had the engine harness and dash harness and body harness laid out on the floor in the garage, and once I got everything figured out that I could actually get it to run, and we tore down the 4.6 and also swapped the oil pan in November. In December 2017, I built the transmission crossmember, which was some angle iron, and I used the Mustang 6R80 transmission mount for that. And I started scoping out the transmission cooler lines. In February 2018, I picked back up on it and started doing things like fuel lines, installing the cats, the oil filter relocation, and then I finally was able to do a test run on the engine. And that was very crude. I think that was maybe on my first video of YouTube. I'll check that. March 2018, I did my temporary setup for the electric power steering, and that was pretty interesting because I didn't have to, there was a lot of parameters that I didn't have to follow once I realized I was doing a really temporary mock-up for test purposes. So I'll pop a picture up here and let you see what that looks like. And then I fabricated the mounts for after the test was successful, then I fabricated the mounts for the rack and drilled and welded all that. April didn't do a whole lot. April 2018, I just basically ground down the welds and painted the area where we were working. May 2018, I did the AC compressor bracket. I had to bend one of the AC lines a little bit, and I installed the MMR water pump pulley, which is just a lightweight water pump pulley, and started looking at the transmission thermal unit, which is the heater / cooler that's on the engine bay side. Didn't really do a whole lot in the middle of 2018 for some reason. I don't know why. Probably because I bought a new truck and was busy playing with that. So I picked back up in August of 2018, and I was doing out here on the floor, the removing wires of the dash harness, the body harness, and the engine bay harnesses, and then which includes the battery junction box. September 2018, I had the transmission thermal unit. I actually built the bracket for that and built some of the lines for that. And I built my first version of the steering shaft, electric fans and brackets for that, and then the PCM bracket that went in the firewall. October 2018, I installed the radiator fans. I modified the upper radiator hose. I basically clocked it in a different position because it's got a keyway on it. I modified the original 2003 airbox to accept my 2015 intake tube, and modified the vacuum network and started swapping fuel pump stuff. November 2018, I modified the fuel sending unit in the tank, and then I started cutting and modifying the tank itself. And again, this is one of those things that you wouldn't have to do this if you weren't planning on relocating the battery to the bed. relocate the battery in the floor of the bed, which meant in my case I was sacrificing some of the fuel space. So this is one of those things where I'm going to have a lot more time in it than maybe in more of a generic install. December, I put the sealer in the tank after having it welded. January 2019, I mounted the battery junction box on the fender on the passenger side. I depinned the new frame rail harness that runs from here down to the gas tank, and I pulled out all the taillight wiring and stuff like that. Modified the heater hoses and the coolant lines. And February 2019, I built the jump post bracket and built the kill switch bracket for the kill switch under the bed, battery kill switch. March 2019, I started doing the power wire relocation. I took my interior out of the back of the truck and I built an amp rack and a distribution rack. And April 2019, I started doing the mega fuse install and the distribution blocks that are on the back wall. Some ground cabling. I mounted the fuel pump driver module under the bed. I fabricated the right hand harness bracket, and that's where that plate that used to sit where the original 2003 PCM was. And then that involved depinning a wiring harness. And I also, still April 2019, I did the battery box, started wiring that out, and then wiring in the kill switch, and then I started working on the cluster modifications. And that's where I custom mounted the 2015 cluster inside the shell of the 2003 cluster. May 2019, I did the accelerator bracket, which is a conversion bracket from two different bolt patterns on the firewall, and I installed the dash and body harnesses into my dash. I modified the fuel pump carrier and swapped pumps, started building the vent lines, and then I test fitted the tank. June 2019, the radiator cover was cut and trimmed. It goes over the top of the radiator. I filled the truck with coolant. I built some fuel lines. I modified and installed the filler neck. I extended the accelerator wiring. I installed the outer tie rods and the shift cable bracket. July 2019, I did the brake switch relay, and this is wiring integrations between the two harnesses. Parking brake, signal. I bolted the cluster in finally. I built the shifter harness and the shifter console and the shifter bracket, so all that stuff was kind of all lumped together. August 2019, I did the carrier bracket and built the cross member for the drive shaft. I started fiberglassing and sanding the console, and I removed my first version of the steering shaft because I had issues with it, as you recall. September 2019, I cut and welded the left-hand catalyst pipe, and that was to get it sitting at a little bit better angle. I started developing the second version of steering shaft and did my first real test drive, and then got the exhaust welded. October 2019, I worked on what's called a key-in circuit, and that is the circuit that tells the respective computers that there's a key present in the ignition, not the ignition switch part, but just there. And also started working on the multifunction switch, which is part of the from the donor, the steering column stuff. 2019, so basically up to here, this is running and driving truck. Coyote swap is done. I'm still working on the truck, but this is where we're going to stop the generic numbers, and we're going to keep going with what I've done from there, above and beyond. November 2019, I removed the bed and I started the back half fabrications. December 2019, I did the axle or differential building and started mocking up the 4-link setup. January 2020, I did 4-link bars. I reworked the spare cross member, which I replaced the jack for the, or spare winch, whatever you want to call it. Watts link fabrication, lots of welding and grinding, installed the coilovers, installed the Watts link, and then reinstalled the bed. February 2020, I modified the 4-link bars and adjusted the ride height, and that was to get the axle centered, as you recall. April 2020, I did a new carrier bracket, and that was to try to streamline my drive shaft a little bit and hopefully fix some issues there, and it's been pretty good since then. May 2020, I finalized the install on the interior central junction box CJB, the interior fuse box from the donor, and then I repaired the oil leak that I had on the oil filter relocation kit. June 2020, I did the stainless brake lines and new front brakes, and I depinned the original 4.6 engine bay wiring. July 2020, I did the temp cylinders for the automator gauges, and then built the harness for that, and then I charged the AC system. October 2020, I did the D-pad wiring on the steering column cover. And then November, I bought the Lightning wheels. December, I bought the 2 new tires, the Goodyear Eagle F1 Supercar 3. And then currently right now, I'm starting to work on my long tube headers install, which will have to be modified because of course not. Of course, they wouldn't just go straight in. So that gets you up to where we're at right now with it. So from here, I will do a third part video where I'm gonna start talking about the cost aspect of the Coyote swap. And my guesstimate that I put in this video actually was kind of reviewing my list of stuff that I did and taking out the stuff that I knew I wouldn't have needed to do for Coyote swap, but also things like my steering. I spent probably 10 or 15 hours fabricating and welding for that. And if you were using your own old hydraulic system, or you were in a Mustang that already has a rack in it or something like that, you potentially saving a lot of time there. So I had no idea what it would take to put a control back in. So I did ask on one of my Coyote swap group Facebook pages, and it seems like most people are saying around 150 hours is kind of average for what you could expect to spend. One guy said 100 hours, and I was like, it seems a little light. But it just depends on what car you're putting it in, and how much you're willing to spend on parts versus making stuff, versus if there's even parts available. My truck, there was almost nothing available because I was one of the first people in the world to do it. So in this truck, and of course I went above and beyond. I did factory. I have 60-70 hours just in wiring of taking apart the factory harnesses. So that's another reason my numbers are pretty high compared to the average of 150-ish hours. And then doing things like my cluster, the cluster swap, I've got probably 8 or 10 hours just in that. So it just kind of goes to show that just depends on what level you want it at and how custom you want to be, and the sky's the limit as far as how much you want to spend and how detailed you want the build to be. But so I kind of just, I guess, maybe a little humble brag, but I was estimating 160-ish hours on my end of what I was coming up with, based off my list of what it took to put my truck together, of just a generic version of it. And then the people on different Facebook group were suggesting somewhere around 150-hour mark. So a little humble brag that even though I haven't done that as a generic build, I still have a decent idea of what it would take. So anyways, thanks for checking out my video. I appreciate y'all hanging out for another video of mine, and look forward to the next one. To see y'all soon. Bye.